Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be taking a look at the Sharks' road to the playoffs. Now, those 3 previous games prior to the All-Star break were not very good and really put a hamper on the Sharks' playoff chances. Now, most people are predicting them to be at around 1 or 2%. But the bright side, 1 or 2% is higher than 0%. So that means there is, of course, a chance. And the chance might be slightly bigger than some of you might be thinking. So I've separated the games the Sharks have left in the teams against they have left into 4 separate categories. The first category, the teams in green, these are the teams that find themselves somehow below the Sharks in the standings. So the Ducks, the Devils, the Senators, the Kings, and there's a couple others who the Sharks don't have any more games against, like the Red Wings. These 6 games are basically must-wins on the schedule. We saw just about last month where the Sharks lost to the Detroit Red Wings 2-0 and shut out, a disappointing loss, a very, very embarrassing loss. That can no longer be the case now. The Sharks can only afford a few losses here or there, and they cannot come against these teams that find themselves behind the Sharks in the standings. If the Sharks can't manage to go at the very least 5-1, if not 6-0, honestly, then there is maybe not a lot of hope to actually be able to make the playoffs. In the purple category, these are the teams that do find themselves ahead of the San Jose Sharks in the standings. In fact, going from the Sharks to the next team up above them is a huge jump in terms of point percentage, 0.05, which is a lot. It might not sound like a lot, but it is. And in this category, we find 6 teams, or 5 teams technically, the Wild twice, the Jets, the Rangers, the Blackhawks, and the Canadiens. These are all teams that are not in the playoff spot, but they are in a playoff race, so they cannot be taken lightly. Unlike the teams in green, where I said the Sharks basically need to win all 6 of them, the Sharks can afford a potential loss, maybe 2 losses. Basically, in the 12 games combined here against these teams not in the playoff spot, the Sharks probably need to go at the very least 10-2, if not 11-1, or even 12-0. It's going to be tough, as I said, but that's the reality the Sharks have put themselves in. Then the next section, 9 of them, 9 teams. This is basically teams that are in a playoff spot, as well as the Leafs, who are a couple points out, but find themselves pretty middle of the pack in terms of the standings. And interestingly enough, of these 9 teams, 8 of those games are against Pacific Division rivals. 3 games against the Flames, with 2 against the Oilers, 2 against the Canucks, as well as 1 game against the Coyotes. These are probably the most important games on the schedule. As we know, the Sharks will likely have to leapfrog a couple of Pacific Division teams if they want to be able to make it to the wild card. So whether this be the Golden Knights, the Coyotes, the Oilers, the Flames, the Canucks, since all those teams are basically 1 point within each other, more or less, the Sharks need to win a bunch of these 4-point games. I would say over those 8 division games, the Sharks probably need to have a record of around 7-1 to put themselves in a pretty solid position, maybe 6-2. Then when you take a look at the game against the Leafs, they probably would have to win that one. So basically, those 12 games against the not so great teams, they probably need to go at around 11-1 pace, and then these next 9 games maybe at around 7-2. That puts the Sharks' record at 18-3. When we take a look at the last 11 games on the schedule, this is the cream of the crop of the NHL. All these teams have a 0.6 point percentage or higher. Now, there is a bit of difference between the Stars and the Flyers compared to the Bruins, the Blues, the Lightning, but they're all in one category. Over these 11 games, these are going to be very, very tough, but we have seen the Sharks put up good performances, especially in the month of January, which was a very tough schedule for the Sharks, against a lot of those very good teams. They beat the Stars. They were very, very competitive against the Blues. They were quite competitive against the Capitals. They probably should have won that game, in fact. And so there can be some hope that the Sharks will play well against these teams again. However, you also take a look at their first game against the Bruins this year, their first game against the Lightning this year, and those didn't go particularly well either. Same goes with their game against the Panthers or the Avalanche. However, over this 11-game stretch, the Sharks basically need to have a winning record, it seems. 7-4 probably around where they need to land. This would make it, when I take a look at the other first 21 games, they would have, with a 7-4 and then an 18-3 record, they would be 25-7, which should be enough to make the playoffs. It very well will be enough to make the playoffs. With that prediction of 25-7, they probably can afford a couple of losses because As you'll see here, I predicted them that they need to make out around 94 points to be able to make the playoffs. That is a 24-8-0 record, or when you take into account overtime losses, something like 23-7-2 or 22-6-4. The Sharks have 16 home games and 16 away games left, so there isn't really an imbalance there. The Sharks need to play well at both on the road as well at home. But let's take a look at this prediction for how many points the Sharks will need to make the playoffs. I put it at 94, which is a pretty safe bet. However, when you take a look at the points needed to make the playoffs just last year, it tells a different story. So in the Eastern Conference, the Columbus Blue Jackets were the second wildcard team, and they had 98 points to make it to the playoffs. So in that situation, the Sharks probably would miss this season. However, in the Western Conference, the Colorado Avalanche were the second wildcard team, and they only needed 90 points to make it. This means that this 94 point prediction might actually end up being somewhat lower. Now, why was it 98 in the East and 90 in the West? Well, there's two reasons why the point total to make the playoffs might drop. The first would be a lot of parity in the conference. When you take a look at the Eastern Conference last year, teams like the Devils, the Senators, the Red Wings, these were very, very bad teams that a lot of teams could sort of just beat up on to get those points, meaning they were much lower in the standings in the Eastern Conference. And so there arose to be maybe like 10 or so teams that were just much better than the rest in the Eastern Conference. However, when you take a look in the Western Conference, there actually was a lot more parity. The lowest point team in the West still had at the very least 70 points, meaning the points were a lot more balanced out between the 15 teams in the Western Conference. The second reason why the point total might be somewhat lower is the interconference record. The Western Conference versus the Eastern Conference last year had a point percentage of 0.54-1. And when you count overtime losses as losses, this means that the Western Conference actually lost more games than they won against the Eastern Conference. This season, the Western Conference is actually on pace to have an almost identical point percentage, also at about 0.541. And when you take a look at the parity in the Western Conference this season, a lot of the teams are very, very close, except the California teams, the Ducks, the Kings, and the Sharks. However, in this situation, we are assuming that the Sharks are going to make some sort of miracle run, and so we're only taking a look at how the Ducks and the Kings will go if they stay on pace. The Kings will get into the high 60s, around 67 or 68 points, while the Ducks will be at around the mid 70s. The team next lowest would be the Minnesota Wild if you don't count the Sharks, and the Wild are on pace for about 85 points. So there will be some pretty close calls in the Western Conference, some very, very nice parity, and when you consider the fact that the Western Conference isn't that great compared to the Eastern Conference in terms of matchups, it's very possible that this 94 points is an overestimate of what the Sharks will need to make the playoffs, and it could end up coming in at around 92 or 91. For the Sharks to actually be able to make it, which is very good news. However, it will still be very, very tough. Even a 23-9 record or a 22-9-1 record, those are still going to be very, very difficult to put up. But there is a chance, as I said, 1 or 2% to make the playoffs. That is still a chance, and we'll see how the Sharks do. It'll be very, very interesting just right out of the All-Star break to see what they can do. Their first game against the Anaheim Ducks, a team below them in the standings, is more or less a must-win, but the interesting stretch comes after that. 5 games, 4 of them against divisional foes, the other one being against the Lightning. If they can go 4-1 or maybe 3-1-1 during that stretch of games, there will be hope for the Sharks to make the playoffs. However, if they go something like 1-3-1 or even 2-3, it may be time to just accept the Sharks' fate. Another important aspect, just as the last thing, is the first 12 games after the All-Star break lead up to the trade deadline, meaning if the Sharks even if the Sharks were to be able to put up a 24-8 record, if it is backlogged and the first 12 games actually are just, let's say, 8-4, that might make Doug Wilson pull the trigger on actually selling at the trade deadline, even if, unbeknownst to him, the team was actually going to go on a miracle run in the last 20 games to make it, meaning these first 12 games after the All-Star break will be some of the more important ones of the last 32. Class dismissed.